What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a comparison between the Motorola Moto G Stylus 2022 and the Visible Midnight. Now before we go any further, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It helps out the channel a lot. And if you want to learn more about either of these phones, be sure to check out my full reviews and tips and tricks videos for them as well. But with that being said, let's get started. So the Motorola Moto G Stylus 2022 has a 6.8-inch 90Hz IPS LCD display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 396, and an aspect ratio of 20.5 by 9. We got a hole punch up here for the front-facing camera, and this camera is 16 megapixels. Now the Visible Midnight has a 6.52-inch LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 269, and an aspect ratio of 20 by 9. We got a water drop notch up here for the front-facing camera, and this camera is 8 megapixels. So overall, both of these phones do have pretty good displays for what they are, but clearly the Moto G Stylus 2022 does have a much better display. With the 1080p resolution versus 720p, the image on the Moto G Stylus is much sharper, and with the IPS LCD display, the colors are a lot brighter and more vibrant in general. But that being said, for what it is, the Visible Midnight doesn't really look bad. Besides the quality, clearly the Moto G Stylus 2022 is much bigger as well, and having a larger display means things are going to look a lot better and be easier to see in general, so this is definitely an advantage if you're consuming a lot of content. Another thing about the Moto G Stylus 2022 that's really nice is with the 20.5 by 9 aspect ratio, we're getting a slightly taller form factor here, so when you're viewing videos in landscape mode, it's going to look a little nicer, and if you're reading something, for example, you'll be able to fit more on the screen without having to scroll as much. Now the Moto G Stylus 2022 is getting 128GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and the Visible Midnight is getting 32GB with microSD card expansion as well. So clearly the Moto G Stylus 2022 has a huge advantage here with quadruple the storage of the Visible Midnight. So if you're a power user and you have lots of apps, you're definitely going to want to go with the Moto G Stylus, because with the Visible Midnight, 32GB is honestly barely even enough for an average user, so that's definitely something to keep in mind. Yes, there is microSD card expansion, but having more storage on the phone itself is just so much nicer. So again, if you're going to be doing lots of activities on your phone, if you have lots of apps, data, stuff like that, then the Moto G Stylus 2022 with 128GB of internal storage is definitely going to be the better choice here. Now there's no wireless charging with the Moto G Stylus 2022, but the Visible Midnight surprisingly does support 10-watt wireless charging. Now this is why I say in so many of my videos that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me why mid-range phones don't have wireless charging, because the Visible Midnight is literally just a $100 phone versus the Moto G Stylus that retails for around $300, so I don't really get why the really inexpensive phone has wireless charging, but the mid-range phone doesn't. But that being said, wireless charging is a nice feature to have. It's not a huge game changer or anything, but it's definitely something that if you have it and get used to using it, you'll definitely start to appreciate. Now both of these phones have fingerprint scanners on the power keys, definitely a great spot for a fingerprint scanner, and both of the phones have face unlock as well, giving you an extra option to unlock them. But let's go ahead and give these fingerprint scanners a try, starting with the Moto G Stylus. There we go, one more time. And there we go. Real fast and responsive, no issues here. Moving on to the Visible Midnight. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So the fingerprint scanners on both of these phones are real fast and responsive, no issues here at all. And again, it's really nice to see that both of them have face unlock as well. Now taking a look at the rear camera setup here, we got a triple camera with the Moto G Stylus 2022 with a 50 megapixel main camera, an 8 megapixel ultra-wide camera that also doubles as a macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. With the Visible Midnight, we got a triple camera setup as well with a 13 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra-wide camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So both of these phones, for what they are, do have pretty nice camera setups, but the Moto G Stylus 2022 is going to be better, both in quality and features, seeing that it does have a macro camera, while the Visible Midnight doesn't. Now for video, both of these phones do have a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, which is kind of a disappointment on the part of the Moto G Stylus, because the previous model of this phone, the Moto G Stylus 2021, did have the ability to shoot in 4K, at least in the rear camera, and that was something that was a really nice thing to have. But unfortunately, Motorola took that feature away with this phone. I'm not really sure why. But as it is, again, both of these phones do have a max quality of 1080p. Now internally, the Moto G Stylus 2022 is getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio G88 processor. The Visible Midnight is getting 3GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio P22. And honestly, for a phone in this price range, it is nice to see that we're getting 3GB of RAM here, because I want to say most really entry-level phones only have 2. But that being said, I ran a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on both of these phones. And with the Moto G Stylus, we're getting a single core score of 368 and a multi-core score of 1304. With the Visible Midnight, we're getting a single core score of 147 and a multi-core score of 820. So clearly there's a huge difference here. The Moto G Stylus is definitely going to be the faster of the two. But that being said, if you're just doing basic activities like browsing the web, going on social media a little bit, but you're really not going to be on your phone a whole lot, then the Visible Midnight is still going to get the job done. But if you are going to be on your phone more and you just want a faster device in general, then the Moto G Stylus 2022, while not being the fastest phone in the world, is definitely going to be a much better choice. Now for battery, the Moto G Stylus 2022 has a 5000 mAh battery and the Visible Midnight has a 4000 mAh battery. And both of these phones support 10-watt fast charging as well. So here, the Moto G Stylus 2022 is definitely going to have a huge advantage with a 5000 mAh battery. That's pretty much maxed out in the US market at least. And this is going to give you a ton of battery life throughout the day, probably multiple days for that matter, depending on how you use your phone. And down the road, as this battery degrades, it's not really going to affect you nearly as quickly as it would with, say, the Visible Midnight, because you're already starting out with so much more battery life than you need. But on the other hand, the Visible Midnight with a 4000 mAh battery is definitely not terrible by any means. It's really just kind of average, and you're still probably going to get over a day worth of battery life. Again, depending on how you use your phone, because if you're doing lots of activities that consume battery, of course, it's going to drain quite a bit faster. But overall, even though the Visible Midnight doesn't really have a terrible battery, the Moto G Stylus 2022 is going to be quite a bit better. Now, neither of these phones have NFC, so if you like to use mobile contactless payment services like Google Pay, unfortunately, you won't be able to with either of these devices. But now that we've gone over some of the specs of the phones, let's take a closer look at their designs. On the left side here, we got the slots for the SIM card and the microSD cards. On the bottom here, with the Moto G Stylus, we got the 3.5mm headphone jack. For both of them, we got the microphones, USB-C ports, speakers, and then with the Moto G Stylus, we got the stylus right here. On the right side, we got the power keys that also double as the fingerprint scanners, volume down, volume up. On the top, we got the noise canceling microphones. And for the Visible Midnight, we got the 3.5mm headphone jack right here. On the back, we got the camera setups and the flash. And both of these phones have pretty much the same metallic kind of finish. They don't pick up too many fingerprints, and overall, I would say they look pretty good. Between the two, I would say the Moto G Stylus does look quite a bit better. Much more modern, more premium, has a nice, more sleek design overall. But with that being said, for what it is, the Visible Midnight really doesn't look that bad. It's not too bulky, it has this nice boxy finish that makes it look a little bit more unique, and it has some weight to it, which for a phone in this price range, I mean, again, this is just a $100 phone, so really entry level, super inexpensive, but its weight does make it feel much higher quality. But in conclusion, which of these devices is better? Now, in this case, this is a pretty obvious one. The Moto G Stylus 2022, being a much higher end phone, and just based on features alone, is the better device here. It has a larger display that's higher quality as well, quadruple the storage, a better camera setup, a larger battery, a faster processor, and a stylus to top it all off. But on the other hand, the Visible Midnight really isn't a bad device, especially for its price. I mean, it's just a $100 phone, and really if you're just using your phone for basic activities, like sending text messages, making calls, browsing the web, maybe some light social media use and video streaming, this phone really is going to get the job done just fine. And when it really comes down to it, sure, the Moto G Stylus 2022 is the better device here, but there's not really a whole lot this phone can do that the Visible Midnight can. And again, the Visible Midnight does have wireless charging, which of course really isn't a feature that most people would use to make a decision between phones, but it is worth pointing out that it does have that feature, whereas the Moto G Stylus 2022 doesn't. So at the end of the day, if you're looking for a more mid-range phone, if you're going to be taking lots of photos, consuming a lot of content, if you're going to have lots of apps, and just be on your phone a lot, then the Moto G Stylus 2022, of course, is going to be a better choice. But if you're not going to be using your phone a ton, you don't need the biggest battery, fastest processor, or best camera, and you just want a more basic device to do basic activities with, then the Visible Midnight is probably going to be all you need. And honestly, for its price, it does provide a pretty exceptional amount of value. Now, once again, if you want to learn more about either of these phones, be sure to check out my full reviews and tips and tricks videos for them on the channel. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you found this information useful as well. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. But as always, I will see you in the next video.